Hi everyone, and welcome to a new webinar from World-Languages. We're very pleased to have you here with us for this webinar titled Enacting a Social Justice-Oriented Language Curriculum. We're very happy to have our speaker, L.J. Randolph, here. So we're very pleased to let you know more about this interesting topic. So now I'll leave you with my colleague, Sarah.
Thank you, Sabrina. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us in our next webinar in our very busy webinar series this spring. My name is Sarah Stefanich, and I am one of the World Language Sales Consultants with CLET World-Languages. I'm happy to be here with you all, and I specialize particularly with Spanish higher ed materials. I was a Spanish teacher in several different universities and colleges for 10 years. And during that time, it was right during COVID, so the past couple of years, I was lucky enough to attend several webinars with our speaker today, Dr. L.J. Randolph. And so I'm very excited to be back listening to him again tell us about very important topics for us as world language teachers. And so Dr. L.J. Randolph is an assistant professor of world language education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His teaching career has spanned over 20 years, including time as a Spanish teacher and an ESL teacher, at the secondary level. His research and teaching focuses on various critical issues in language education, including teaching Spanish to heritage and native speakers, incorporating justice-oriented, anti-racist, anti-colonial pedagogies, and centering Blackness and Indigenous in the classroom. He is the co-editor of a book that has just come out, How We Take Action, Social Justice in Pre-K through 16 Classrooms. He is also the author of a chapter in the volume Honing Our Craft, which we'll tell you about a little bit at the end here on social justice-oriented language, and that's kind of where the inspiration for today's webinar comes from. And if that's not enough, he's also the president-elect of ACTFL and a past president of FLANC and the AATSB chapter in North Carolina. So please join me, everyone, in welcoming our presenter for today, Dr. L.J. Randolph.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sarah and Sabrina, for those wonderful introductions. And I do want to acknowledge before I forget the organizations that Sarah mentioned. I'm not representing any of those organizations with this webinar. So any opinions expressed here are my own and not representative of those organizations. I'm looking at the chat and it's cool to see all of the people from all over. I see a couple of my former students my former grad students are back in North Carolina. I saw Autumn in there. I see some folks, some new colleagues in Wisconsin, and lots of other familiar names and faces. So hey, Liliana. So just very excited that you all decided to join me during probably what's the busiest, most hectic time of the year, especially if you are a teacher. And so I really appreciate your being here, and I hope that we can learn together and that you get something out of this. And I'm especially looking forward to the Q&A session at the end where we get to unpack things a little bit more. So thank you all for attending and being here with me today. So as Sarah mentioned, the topic of my talk is enacting a social justice-oriented curriculum. For the agenda for today, I want to talk a little bit about some foundational understandings. I think it's important to think about the thinking, to do some background, and to understand what we mean when we say social justice, and what are some strategies for ensuring continued implementation of social justice in our classes, and not just, okay, here are some lessons that I did that may or may not work for you in your particular context. We'll look at some curricular frameworks, and then I will share some specific learning segments that I have used with my learners. We'll end with some takeaways, some do's and don'ts, and then we'll have a Q&A session. And I realize I'm talking, but I'm not advancing the slides here, so sorry about that. I want to begin by talking a little bit about my own positionality, because I think that it's so important to recognize that this work is subjective. There is no objective voice when it comes to anything really, but especially something as nuanced and as dependent upon our experiences as social justice. So I want to talk a little bit about who I am. If you heard me talk before, some of this may sound familiar because I always begin talks by sharing a little bit about who I am. So this is me in high school. I think maybe I might have been in 12th grade there, 11th grade. That was me in Spanish class, my Spanish teacher, Senorita Gullion at the time. So growing up, although it was a positive experience, I mean, I became a Spanish teacher. So definitely, I liked it and it was positive. But Spanish was definitely a foreign language in every sense of the word. It was in like the late 90s in North Carolina. North Carolina was becoming a new gateway state for immigration from folks from Mexico and other Central American countries. And so there were people who spoke Spanish who were of Latin descent and Latin identity who lived in my community, but I never really saw or interacted with any of them, either in my community or at school. And so there was that disconnect. And then there was also this disconnect of seeing people and experiences that represented my own identity in the curriculum. I remember having to imagine that there were Black people somewhere who spoke Spanish because I didn't see evidence of that in the classroom. And I didn't really connect with the language until later in college when I took a linguistics class, and then I started taking some more advanced Spanish classes. And then that's when I started to delve more deeply into the music and the culture and poetry and literature of some Caribbean countries and other countries where they did have a large Black population, and where I was able to make that connection. And my interest in social justice then really stemmed from the fact that I didn't want my students to go through that. When I started teaching high school, I taught high school for about 10 years. I didn't want my students, even at the novice level, to feel like their experiences and their identities were foreign in the foreign language classroom, right? And so I wanted to show them, even from an early age, that language learning can be a unifying and empowering experience at all levels, even at that level 1 novice class. So I share that to say that first and foremost, and I'm a Black man, in case that's not obvious, I approach social justice through a lens of racial justice. That's sort of my own subjectivity. That's the way that I approach the topic of social justice. I recognize that that is one of many ways to think about justice-oriented instruction. I think that it is a key component of it, but I do recognize that it's one of many ways that people may think about this topic. And that's why diversity in our profession is so important, because other folks will look at justice from different perspectives than I will. And so that's why we need to have diverse voices at the table when we're talking about themes of justice. I don't wish to position myself as an expert. Just like all of you, I am also on this reflective journey. So to share a little bit about my teaching philosophy, I do think that social justice and language education are inextricably linked, and that's the way that I approach my teaching practice. This is a funny reply to a tweet that I made. I don't remember what my original comment was, but I do remember this person somehow saw my comment and said, well, what can you expect from a man whose job is to teach languages, but thinks his job is teaching social justice while teaching languages? And I thought, wow, that's actually, I'll take that. That's a really good characterization of how I view my work in language education and how I view my role as an educator. And so even though they meant that to be like a gotcha snarky comment, I actually embrace that identity. I openly embrace the possibilities of social justice in the language classroom. As I mentioned earlier in the outline, we will look at some specific examples, but before we do that, we'll talk about some foundational understandings. And the reason why is because of what Gloria Latson-Millen says when she talks about culturally relevant pedagogies. She says it really has to do with the philosophical outlook towards one's approach to teaching. People think that it's something that can be packaged, someone will come along with something like culturally responsive lessons, social justice lessons, whatever. And, teachers don't have to think, they just have to do whatever the lesson says. And that's really not the case. It's context driven, and it matters. The identity of the person who's teaching it matters, and the identity of our students matter. So that's where I would like to start, with some foundational understandings. I have a Mentimeter poll that I would like for you to participate in. So there are a few ways that you can do this. You can go to menti.com and you can type in that 8-digit code. If your screen is large enough, you can snap that QR code and join that way. And then also, I am going to copy and paste the direct link into the chat. So that's another way that you can go to the page. And I think that it gives you like 3 to 5 words that you can put in to talk about what you think of when you think of social justice. Please only put 1 word in each box, and don't put phrases, and don't put articles like A and B, etc. So I'll give you a second to do that. And that will be in the Menti poll. So you would click that link to do it. Sarah, you're the only person that I can see. Can you give me a thumbs up that is showing? Sorry. Okay, gotcha. Just making sure.
It's in the chat, and I scanned the QR code and that worked for me. So I think.
Perfect. Great. I didn't want to navigate from the page just yet, because I know that other people might need that code. Oh, great. I see the reactions. I can't see your faces or who's doing the reactions, but they do come up. So that's good to know. So that's some encouragement. So if I say something that connects with you, give me a thumbs up. I see those, or a thumbs down. I'll see those too. And, we'll circle back and revisit what we're talking about. But here's what we have then. So of course, equity is huge. Fairness. I see empathy, I see change, I see activism, I see awareness. I'm trying to read the ones that are biggest to me. What else do we have? Power sharing. I think that person cheated. They used a hyphenated word. Self-determination also. Those are good. I like those. Understanding. That's important. And that's kind of the core of a language education. So that speaks to the relevance of this to the language classroom, right? I see tolerance, I see Black, I see vulnerable, I like that. Flourishing, I like that. Yeah, there are no wrong answers. Social justice is all of that, all of what you wrote. Like I said earlier, it's subjective and it's context driven. I hesitate to, I don't even pretend to try to create this prescribed definition of what social justice is, because I think that's impossible. And I think all of these are great things that you've written. And I imagine that even common words like equity and equality, empathy, fairness, those look different in practice in different contexts anyway. And just to give you an idea of kind of the way that I approach this and what I think of, and again, this isn't the quote unquote right answer, this is just sort of ways that I unpack it. I think about sort of equitable distribution of power, tangible and intangible resources. I like this idea of mattering. You're valued enough to be visible, both literally and figuratively, physically, and also in the curricular materials that we use. You're valued enough to be important and heard. So I love all of that. And I'm going to go ahead and move to the next poll here, but don't do it yet. Okay. Just want to have it in the queue and ready for when we go next time. So I also recognize that social justice is also interdisciplinary in nature. Don't worry, I'm not going to expand on each of these elements. I'm trying not to bore you today. But I do recognize that it's connected to all of these other concepts like ICC, critical pedagogies, culturally responsive sustaining pedagogies, multicultural education, queer theory, racial linguistics, transformative learning, anti-racism and anti-colonialism. ICC, for those who may not know, intercultural communicative competence. So it's related to all of those things. And I recognize that. And for that reason, the definition of social justice is so broad and messy that it would just take too long to get into it. So it looks like I stopped sharing my screen. Sorry about that.
Perfect. There we go.
Yeah, sorry about that. I must have, when I hit escape out of the full screen for the poll, it must have stopped sharing. So yeah, that's the image that I was talking about. It's related to all of those things. And so with that in mind, I want to talk about what is the purpose of a language education. One way that we think about language education is via sort of the real world application, sort of study abroad, competing in an international global market, sort of this very capitalistic view, I think. And I get it from an advocacy standpoint. Those often end up being the most convincing arguments when you're trying to secure funding and make sure that your program doesn't get cut or something like that. But ultimately, I think that those things allow us to ignore certain realities. Terry Osborne criticizes what I just talked about as so-called marketplace ideologies, as if those are the only reasons that people will want to learn a language. And when I talk about the realities that it allows us to ignore, well, I'm going to show you a number here. This is less than 1%. According to Friedman's study, just cited by Reagan and Osborne recently, although about 18% of the US population at the time of the study reported speaking another language, and that compares to roughly 30% of Canadians, over 50% of Europeans, less than 1% of American adults were proficient in a language that they started studying in a US classroom, with the exception of English. And so I think that if we're saying that proficiency is the only thing that matters, that's the only goal of language education, then there's a huge disconnect. We need to think about what proficiency means in the context of other relevant and important goals in learning a language. At a previous institution, I taught the third semester language class. I taught third semester Spanish. So that was a class that most students took in order to graduate. That was the class that most students took in order to meet the language requirement. So I had a huge variety of students in that class. I had students who were first year students who placed into it and maybe would even go on to be minors or majors in the language. I had students who maybe placed into that class when they were a first year student, but they waited until they were a senior to actually take the class. And so by that time, you know, they would have struggled in the Spanish 1 class, a one-on-one class with that much gap in having any connection to the language, but they were in that class too. And so you had, you know, these very different motivations for being enrolled in that class. Also had heritage speakers in that class as well. And so I realized that I can't approach this class with the thinking that everyone in here, it's everyone's goal even to be proficient, right? So I had to think, what are the other goals that I might be able to incorporate in order to make this class a meaningful experience for all of those students? For, according to Friedman, the 99% or so, we'll say 95, because this was, you know, a while ago, but over a decade ago, we'll say the 95% of students who may, you know, take the class, but not go on to be proficient in the language. And the thing is, even if students do become proficient, what then? And you may have seen this, it went viral a couple of years ago. This is Aaron Schlossberg. He's in a deli, he hears a couple of people speaking in Spanish, and he just goes off on his racist tirade. And the thing about it is, if you look at what he does, he's a lawyer in New York, right? And he also promotes the fact that his company is a multilingual company. So this is someone who clearly understands the practical linguistic importance of multilingualism, but has no understanding of or sensitivity or compassion toward the people who actually speak those languages. And he actually also doesn't have an understanding of the actual context in which those languages exist, because of all places, it wouldn't be weird to be in New York and hear people speak Spanish. So it makes me wonder what instructional experiences and connections this person made or did not make with the language. In a recent interview with Dory Collin, Jonathan Rosa says, there have always been awful multilingual people. So just studying a language does not automatically make you this compassionate, nice person, empathetic, sympathetic person. So we have to think about multilingualism in service of what? Multilingualism connected to what broader set of political struggles. And so I return to that question: what is the purpose of a language education? It's rhetorical, you don't have to put it in the chat. And I would actually maybe replace that word purpose with possibility. What is the possibility of a language education? We know from research, for some, that involves the global market, things that I was just talking about, the marketplace ideologies. For some, they may travel, they may study abroad, they may travel for leisure, they may travel in the name of quote unquote service, which, that's problematic in and of it. That's another webinar, right? And we also have to be honest that even fluency is for some, right? And so what is for all? I'm not saying that you take those things that are for some and pretend like they don't matter. I believe in a proficiency-oriented language classroom, and you'll see that from the examples that we look at. So please don't get it twisted. Don't think, oh man, LJ is here talking about fluency doesn't matter in the language classroom. I'm sounding out right now, right? That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that for all people, we might think about how language might be a tool for liberation, for empowerment, justice, empathy, community, and perspective transformation. So when I think about what a justice-centered language learning experience looks like in the classroom, here's what I think. I believe it's inherently political. All education is political, a hill I'll die on, anyone who's thought seriously about education has come to this conclusion. So that's not controversial at all. It's intentionally anti-racist and anti-colonial. It centers historically and presently marginalized groups. It takes a critical, intersectional, I would say even messy approach to the study of languages, cultures, and communities. It recognizes that things can't be packed neatly into these boxes, into these Venn diagrams, right? It's collaborative, and it builds community, and it requires self-reflection and humility. And I think that's important, recognizing that we're going to mess up along the way, and that's okay. So we'll talk now about some curricular frameworks, because that's what we're here to discuss. What steps can we take to make sure that we have a curriculum that promotes justice-oriented and justice-centered language education? If you'll humor me, I have one more Mentimeter poll. This is the last one, because mainly because with the free program you only get 2 slides, but also I don't want to make you get involved too much in it. So which of these best describes your instructional context? So some of us, we have prescribed lessons, right? If I'm teaching something, my neighbor down the hallway teaching the same level should be teaching that same thing that day. So in some contexts, that's the case. Some of us have a prescribed curriculum. This was the case for me, where either you have goals that you have to address at each particular level, or you have common curricular materials, like you have a common textbook that you have to use, or something like that. And then some of us may have curricular freedom, and I put freedom in quotation marks because we're still bound by the practices and the cultures of our institutions, so we're never really completely free. But some of you may be able to do what you want. Maybe the powers that be, either they don't care or they trust you enough that that they don't feel the need to sort of dictate what you do in any kind of way. And so I would like to know where most people stand, because where you stand on this continuum matters in terms of the creative space that you'll have in implementing some of the things that we'll talk about today. And in the Mentimeter poll, it's done like a stoplight, but that doesn't mean that one is bad and one is good inherently. It's just the way that this poll works, red, yellow, and green. And that's encouraging to see, actually, that so many people do have that freedom where they kind of get to create their own materials and teach the way they want to. And as I figured, most people, but not by much actually, but most people do have the prescribed curriculum. And then in some cases, people have prescribed lessons. So that's good to know. And also, I feel like that curricular freedom thing can be overwhelming because if you don't have the resources to work with, that's a lot of prep, right? Make sure I don't hit the escape button exiting out of Mentimeter this time. So we're going to start with the World Readiness Standards, rethinking the 5 C's. Why do we need to rethink the 5 C's? Well, I showed you a number earlier. I'm going to show you another number now, the number 0. This is the number of times that you'll see the word race, that you'll see the word sexuality, that you'll see the word gender, unless you're talking about gender of like grammatical gender, gender of nouns, adjectives, etc. The number of times that you'll see discrimination, equality, equity, justice in the World Readiness Standards. And that's not to say that it doesn't support that type of instruction, but just that you have to make that leap. You will see the words culture and diversity quite a bit, but we have to think very intentionally and critically about how we view culture and diversity, because a lot of times they offer a way out to not incorporate some of those things that I mentioned because they're not explicitly listed. And so in the chapter that this is based off of, I did a little bit of reflection on my own and thinking about, well, if I were to sort of rethink the 5 C's in my own instructional context from a justice-oriented perspective, what would that look like? And so that's what these next few slides are. Sorry, the next few slides are a little bit text heavy, but I won't read everything to you. Just want to focus on the parts that are in bold. So the general understanding is what's currently in the World Readiness Standards. And what you see in the social justice understanding is a way that I think would be good for us to think about expanding that description so that it creates space more easily for us to incorporate justice-oriented themes into our class. So I talk about learners for communication, learners valuing all varieties, thinking about multiple contexts with diverse speakers, remembering that language is an intercultural act, as Michael Byram describes, and that it's something that can develop empathy, compassion, and understanding. I saw all of those words when we did that activity at the beginning about what what social justice means. Cultures. Some might think, well, cultures, it's sort of inherently incorporates justice. Well, not really. We can think about practices, products, and perspectives in superficial ways. And for decades, our profession has done just that, really. So when I think of it from a social justice perspective, I think about confronting and challenging social injustices and systems of oppression, centering and celebrating the cultures, histories, and narratives of historically minoritized and marginalized groups. When I think about connections, it's more than just interdisciplinary learning, but we're thinking about collaboration. We're thinking about project-based assignments, and we're thinking about how we can do all of that from a justice and equity-oriented lens. When I think about comparisons, I'm moving away from the Venn diagrams. I'm thinking about how can we critically examine parallels to ways that different cultures and communities engage in justice-oriented movements and initiatives. And when I think about communities, I'm looking at ways that we can study and engage with justice-oriented liberation movements. I'm very interested in ways that communities are engaged in their own liberation, both at the local and global level. And I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. Communities all over the world are engaged in these types of movements. This is Black Lives Matter as seen in Puerto Rico, Brazil, South Korea. And of course, it's not just limited to one movement. On this next slide, I have examples of protests in France. This is LGBTQ plus rights protests at the bottom there. At the top, that's Stop Asian Hate protests in the US in Chicago. In the upper right-hand corner, that's an environmental justice rally in Germany. In the lower right-hand corner, this might be something that you wouldn't even think of, but this is these are people in Japan protesting the war in Ukraine. So a lot of these elements transcend boundaries, transcend national boundaries. So you don't have to be in a specific country. I don't have to teach Russian, for example, to talk about the war between Russia and Ukraine in my classroom. And people worldwide are engaging with these issues of equity and justice. And this is a great opportunity to connect with what's happening in our students' immediate communities, as well as what's going on worldwide in many communities in which the languages we teach are spoken. So that's one way, rethinking the 5 C's. Another thing that we can do is look at the social justice standards from Learning for Justice. So there are 4 domains that Learning for Justice highlights. The first domain is identity, thinking about how we make sense of our individual and collective selves in various historic and cultural contexts. And in a language classroom, this might be reflecting on how I and others negotiate linguistic, cultural, and community identities in a variety of contexts. Diversity in these standards is presented as an asset for building empathy, respect, and understanding. And so in the language classroom, I always think about how I can move beyond studying cultures and communities in ways that are superficial, fact-based, and that focus on the complex and nuanced social, cultural, political, and historical context of the cultures that I'm studying. Justice, I think about how can I look at the 5 C's through a lens of power, privilege, and bias at the individual and institutional level. And then finally, action, taking steps to promote justice and equity in various contexts. And it's important to realize that action can also be planning these steps in addition to enacting the steps. So you don't have to go out and do something. It can be a reflective exercise. So this might be students identifying and aligning themselves with social justice-oriented movements being led by marginalized members of the communities and cultures being studied. I have 2 more ways that you might want to think about this as we look at curricular frameworks. We can look at broad themes. My friend and colleague, Stacey Margarita Johnson, talks about critical topics, counter narratives, and community activism. I modified that a little bit from her original framework. But critical topics might push students to think beyond superficial thinking. Counter narratives center the stories, histories, and cultures of minoritized and marginalized communities. And community activism allows us to look at community-based heroes, organizers, and activists that might otherwise be overlooked in our curriculum. And then finally, I want to talk about points of entry from Glenn and others. Glenn Wassel and I'm forgetting the third author, Wesley, sorry, Pam, if you see this. Is there a history behind this cultural or academic topic that might reveal past or present inequities? Are there accepted truths about this topic that can be challenged? And is this a topic that people from different groups have viewed differently throughout history? And this is important because it allows us to start with what we already have. And what I mean by that, when we think about points of entry from these critical questions, we can look at topics that are typically taught in lower level language classes. I went through a few textbooks and I identified what were some of the common themes for level 1 and level 2, sort of the novice to the novice high, intermediate, low level text. And these are the topics that most of those books talk about. And what we can do is use these questions to think about ways that we might revisit something that we already teach. For example, if you teach sports, I love using tweets and TikToks because the language is very limited and I can present it to my students in comprehensible chunks. But you might, if you're a Japanese professor or teacher, I might use this tweet from Naomi Osaka, who's a popular and talented Japanese American tennis star, who is also a Black woman. And here she talks about, before I am an athlete, I'm a Black woman. And she goes on to talk about how watching the continued genocide of Black people at the hand of police is honestly making me sick to my stomach. So she shares her views on police brutality. And the thing is, all I had to do was open my curriculum to have this voice be represented. I didn't have to go out of my way to talk about police brutality. Someone else is already talking about it. That's what I'm saying. These communities are already talking about these issues. And these are the speech communities that we're teaching. So what I would have my students do with this, just to give a quick example, is maybe create a meme and post them to Padlet, where they select one sentence or highlight or create an original sentence that stood out to them from this. That's something that a novice learner can do. And you can maybe even print those out or create a bulletin board in the class so that those are visible to students and as well as other members of the school community. With entertainment, you might use this resource from Huffington Post, where folks who identified as Afro-Latinx in some way share their stories about their experience in the entertainment world. And sorry to have to use my cloth here, but I turned off my air conditioner so that I wouldn't, the sound wouldn't distort this. It's like, welcome to the Midwest. I'm from North Carolina. At least there, I kind of know what to expect. I mean, we have our fluctuations in weather, but it's not snowing one day and then 80 degrees the next day. So I'm still getting used to the early spring in the Midwest. So yeah, forgive me. Maybe next year I'll be on top of my game after a year of living through this. Those in the Midwest, I know you feel my pain. But what John Leguizamo does here is he basically defines what a counter narrative is. He talks about how he had to create his own projects as an antidote to the system, to the what he calls the Hollywoodness of it all. Gina Torres, who is a Black Cuban actress, talks about how she really has never had a role where she played a Cuban woman. She always played an English-speaking Black woman. And she says when she became an actress, she realized really quickly that the world liked their Latinas to look Italian and not like her. And she is a fluent Spanish speaker as well. And so another example of that, a more recent example, there are some videos here. If you watch this, you'll be able to see the video. It's not loading right now, but I'm not going to show the videos anyway. And there are links to all the videos that I have embedded in the presentation. But Tenoch Huerta, who is in the most recent Black Panther movie, this is a video of him answering the question, why do the vast majority of Mexicans believe that racism doesn't exist in Mexico? And he has a very interesting and thoughtful answer to that is comprehensible to some extent, I think, to many students, because it's just a short TikTok video. And what students can do with this is either create digital posters in TikTok or Flipgrid, or via Padlet or Jamboard, where depending on their proficiency level, they talk about their own experiences as in the same way that these stars did. So they might, if they're a novice level, they might list 5 things that they wish people knew about them, like I am not. So in Spanish, that's just soy, no soy. You just need that, and you need some adjectives. That's all you need. That's all the language you need. In some languages, you don't even need the verb to be, so it's even easier. If they're a little bit more advanced, students might describe a time when someone misunderstood something about them or their own identity. If you teach about employment, if that's a theme that you address, you can link it to an infographic about the everyday struggles of farm workers. And the thing about infographics, again, lots of numbers, lots of very small chunks of language. Students can easily understand that. If you're a little bit more advanced, then, and also the students are a little bit more mature. This is something that I work with the German educator, is looking at when Germany banned prostitution, which is a legitimate profession during the pandemic, and looking at ways that people who are involved in that profession and also their allies engaged in advocacy and protests in order to enact change. And so that's something that's interesting to look at as well. So those are just some little tidbits. What I'll do now is I'll share, I have two examples, and I may go through the second one a little bit quickly because I do have a lot of the resources here, because I want you to be able to go back to this and be able to think about it more deeply, have access to all the resources that I talk about, and be able to incorporate them into your class if you so choose. So the first example that I talk about in my chapter is appropriate for a novice mid class. And the can-do statements that are associated with it are: I can use simple sentences to express how I and others negotiate our identities in multiple spaces. I can use simple sentences to accurately and respectfully describe how people, including myself, are both similar to and different from each other and others in our identity groups. I can exchange basic information about my identity and respectfully express curiosity about the identities of others. So as a pre-reading activity, what I have my students do is think about what are the most important aspects of your identity. And just so that you know, I co-planned this with one of my student teachers at the high school level. So she was teaching, it was a Spanish 2 class, mostly sophomores. So what are the most important aspects of your identity? It could be religion, sexuality, race, gender, your hometown, whatever. And then on the scale of 1 to 10, how does your racial identity affect your daily life? And again, all students need to know are numbers 1 through 10 in order to be able to do this activity. So it's a very low bar of entry in terms of language proficiency that's required. And then we watched the video, and again, all links to all the videos are here in the presentation. And this video is called Blaxicans. I'm Black and Mexican American, and it's difficult for people to figure me out. And so what I have students do as they watch the video is write words or phrases that they associate with the Blaxican identity based on the video. And then we do a comprehension activity where I like to try to shy away from questions as much as possible and think about what are some creative ways that I can make sure that my students are understanding what we're doing. So in Spanish, using their own words, I have my students write 2 comments summarizing 2 of the perspectives presented in the video, giving them the vocabulary that I think they might need, and also co-constructing the vocabulary list as needed. And you can see there the way that I handle gender with adjectives. I just put an X and then I put a star saying X can mean any of these endings. And that usually is enough for students to be able to engage with it. People make a big deal like, oh no, the world's gonna fall apart if I start incorporating this, but those of you who've actually incorporated it into your class, I mean, students, it's no big deal, and is really not a significant instructional shift that you have to do to incorporate gender inclusive language in the class. Then we look at an Instagram campaign where a photographer took several images of people who identified as Blaxican youth, like in their 20s, who identified as Blaxican in Los Angeles. And you can see here, this is, I think her name is Larissa. She talks about her dad is Black and her mom is Mexican. She's from Guadalajara. She grew up more Mexican because of her father, because her father's family didn't live in Mexico. So she talks about how she had to learn how to, her words, how to be Black when she got older. And it's interesting to think about what that might mean. And it's neat to see how she settled on the identity as Blaxican because it was a way for her to recognize her dual identity. So you can do it where you have students, you select the resource for students, or you can have students select their own resources. You can have them search the hashtag Blaxican or the hashtag Afro-Latina, Latine, Latino, Latinx on Instagram or Twitter, and have them identify their own social media posts that they want to talk about. And just quickly, I'll show you what each of these people says. Larissa says she likes to define herself as Blaxican because it's important to recognize her double identity. So her name was Larissa, that's right. Romel says that due to the color of his skin, he has had to live with some of the same difficulties as many African-American youth. Amber grew up in the mixed neighborhood where there were as many Hispanics as African-Americans. And Walter didn't come into contact with the Black community until he was much older. And what's cool about an assignment like this is you can see all of these people, they're roughly the same age, they're all from LA, they all identify as Blaxican, but they all have vastly different experiences, right? So this is one way that we can begin to combat stereotypes, because there's no way that students are going to walk away from this thinking, oh, this is the Blaxican perspective, or this is what all people who identify as Blaxican think. Identity is messy. And when you use authentic resources, that comes to light. So an interpersonal communication activity that I would have my students do is conduct a role play in which they introduce themselves to one of these individuals or one of the people that they chose themselves from their own social media search. What would they share about their own identity? What do they think what do they think the people would describe about themselves? What types of questions would be appropriate in a conversation to ask about experiences? If you were curious, how would we go about doing that? And then we do some critical reflection. And I encourage students to engage in translanguaging when they do this, to use some English if necessary. Many times we would do this outside of class via discussion board, and then the teacher would facilitate a discussion when everyone comes back together. So when in their own lives is it necessary to maintain a double identity? Do they notice any similarities and differences with the people that we have examined with this particular lesson sequence? How does this identity challenge the way that we often think about race in binary black and white terms, right? And in what specific ways might they position themselves as an ally in their own daily lives for issues that may not explicitly relate to their own identity, be it race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. I'll talk more quickly about the second example. This is another example that I talk about in the book chapter, and I begin this with a topic. So the topic is nature and environment. I think that's interesting, that's compelling for many students to talk about that. Students have opinions, right? Some of the vocabulary that you use to talk about that is useful for students. I think it's better if we move away from just a topic to an essential question, right? How do we interact with nature, right? So I think that's a good essential question, and that frames some of the activities that I might have in my classroom. However, this question is not exactly justice oriented. How can we shift it, massage it a little bit, and make it even better? So here's a way that we can think about this from a justice-oriented perspective. What are the responsibilities of individuals and societies with regard to access to natural resources? Now I'm going to be talking about issues of access, responsibility, etc. Two quick things that you can do to kind of test if you're incorporating justice into a topic that you want to discuss or that you want to engage with your students. Think about in what ways will students be engaging in critical thinking and reflection. And this is just one way to do it. Think about how this question or this topic relates back to one of the social justice domains. Am I able to explicitly link it to identity, diversity, justice, action? And if so, that lets me know that I might be on the right track in engaging my learners in justice-oriented learning versus just something that's an interesting cultural topic. Because I think nature and environment, you could approach that in a way that's interesting and fun, but not necessarily justice-oriented. So the level, intermediate, low, the can-do statements with this one, I can react to and evaluate public discourse around these issues. I can identify and compare variables that contribute to how communities experience a natural disaster. I can discuss the impacts of various environmental challenges in my own communities and brainstorm possible action steps. So what I do first is I begin with some warm-up questions. These are just some general questions to get students thinking. And depending on your format, they can do this in small groups. It might be better for them to do it via a discussion board if you're in a remote setting. whatever, but just something to figure out what vocabulary they're going to need for both you and for them, and to begin building those connections and setting that framework, that scaffolding process. Then we do an interpersonal speaking activity where students develop a working definition if they have the proficiency for it. If they don't, just a list of associated words or concepts. When they think of health justice, what words would they associate with that? Environmental justice, environmental racism, right? And then we look at the definition of environmental justice from the US EPA. And there are lots of websites that have translated this to various languages. So this is a good resource to use in your classroom. And we decide, okay, what words will we add? What words do you think we might need to talk about this, this theme in more detail? What I loved about teaching in North Carolina is we did just a very short reading, just a couple of paragraphs and an image caption. This is actually the entire resource. This is all that I use. It literally just these 2 paragraphs and the image caption there. To talk about what's considered to be the birth of the current environmental justice movement, which happened in a small county in North Carolina, Warren County. And if you read Spanish, and even if you don't, you can probably guess what it says there. Who was it led by? African American, Latinx folks, Asian, Pacific American, and American Indian groups. Those were the groups that were leading that charge for environmental justice in those communities. And I think it's important for students to know that those are the heroes. That's what I mean when I talk about community heroes. Those were the hometown heroes who started something that blew up into this big movement across the entire country, the world, really. And so I linked this to what happened with Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico and the community activism that happened in those regions when we think about issues of environmental justice. So as a pre-reading activity, we look at Puerto Rico. And do we talk about Puerto Rican culture? This is what Puerto Rican culture is. This is what Puerto Rico looks like. No, we talk about one community. And I'll tell you why. We talk about the community of Loíza. Why? Look, Loíza does not look like the rest of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a very diverse country. Look at the poverty rate. Look at the Black population. Look at the annual salary there. Like, Loíza is different. So if I'm talking about Puerto Rico, the story of Loíza gets lost in those other demographics, right? And if you read Spanish, you can see there on the right, it talks about how because of the marginalization and the poverty, and also the unfortunate unfortunate in some cases, geographic location, having flood basins, it felt the impact of Hurricane Maria much more greatly than other parts of the island experience. We do a reading where we look at, this is by Amnesty International, Puerto Rico 1 year after Hurricane Maria. And what I like to do is a Google Doc. I'm not very fancy. I just do a Google Doc. I put the students in groups. You know, I think maybe if you get more than 8 people in one group, then the document just becomes too difficult to follow. But I put comments in there. I gloss words. I have my students do that. They come in. I encourage them to engage in translanguaging because, again, the idea here is to understand the resource. Right? So this is not necessarily an interpersonal or presentational speaking activity. We're processing and we're thinking through this resource together. And it's really cool to see the types of questions that they ask. I tell them if they have to look up a word, put it there for everybody, because if they had to look it up, someone else probably needed to look it up, and it's probably an important word. So go ahead and put it in the document there. Quick comprehension activity that I have them do is, instead of questions, I had them think about, okay, what were the pre-existing conditions in Puerto Rico or in this community? Like, maybe we might talk about global warming, Hurricane Irma that had just passed through a few weeks earlier, and the destruction that it had already caused. What were some of the immediate effects? So immediate effect might be loss of electricity. And then what were some of the long-term effects? So long-term effects might be ineffective hospitals that weren't able to treat people, death toll that went above 4,000 folks, right? And then we also center the community activism that was happening there. So we center on a community leader. Her name is Modesta. And this says it all right here, right? The community leaders did what? They self-organized and they began to carry out censuses of their own needs. They know what they need, they just need to be listened to. And that's kind of the moral of this whole learning sequence. Listen to these communities, and especially the people who are engaged in liberation. And as I mentioned earlier, I'll go through this last part here a little bit quickly. We also do an interpretive reading with Raquel Salas Rivera, who is a Puerto Rican poet. And they have a non-binary identity. They use they or he pronouns. And what I love to do is think about who these people are fundamentally, first of all. And so here are some quotes from Raquel Salas Rivera. They say, I don't have to justify my existence or translate my lived experiences. And also, I was angry and devastated when I started writing. And so it's important to know that they were writing these words from a place of anger and devastation. And these are some excerpts from their collection of poetry called While They Sleep, Under the Bed is Another Country. And so with these excerpts, depending on students' proficiency level, I have them decide what they want to do. They can do a one-word summary of each passage. That's something that's easier. A little bit more of a challenge, give each passage a title. A little bit more of a challenge, choose your favorite passage and explain why, right? So I give them the freedom to decide what type of comprehension activity is appropriate for them. And I find that they usually challenge themselves to the appropriate extent. A post-reading activity is to conduct a search on Twitter or Instagram using these hashtags and selecting one or two to post to the Padlet board or the discussion board and provide a brief reaction or commentary. Say what you will about Twitter, I don't love it, but it is a really good, in some cases, a really good historical snapshot of the discourse that was happening around certain events. And you can limit the dates that you search for particular hashtags and kind of get a feel of what people were saying and reacting, how people were reacting at the time. And here are some of the tweets that my students selected for this particular activity. And I want you to tell me, what do you notice about the tweet? Let me find the chat. I don't know where it is. Okay, oh, I missed a lot of stuff. We'll come back to it. I see here is Black Second a term embraced by that community. Yes, that is their term, not mine. That is a term that they adopted in order to self-describe who they are. So that's important. But that was just one random thing that I saw, but that's not even why I went to the chat. What do you notice about that chat, about that tweet that's at the bottom there? Linguistically. Yeah, so someone, thank you. Very, very concise, Dora. Yes. This is a natural example of people using gender inclusive language in the real world, and it pushes back against that narrative that people say that, oh, people don't actually use that in real life. You'll never see examples of that. No, this is a random person on the internet, and they're talking about this using gender inclusive language. And I think that's important for students to see, that it's not just something that we're making a big deal out of in the classroom, that is something that exists and that is embraced in many of these communities. We conclude with an integrated performance assessment, and I'll talk about this quickly, but it incorporates different types of different modes of communication: interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational, with feedback in between. So anytime you see an arrow there, that's me giving feedback to the student. So this is kind of like an integrated performance assessment on steroids. And a lot of times it only involves 3 steps. So this one involved a lot. And there was like a lot of back and forth between me and the students, which I think helped them to create really great products in the end. So just really quickly, they brainstormed social media hashtags associated with environmental justice. My feedback was I helped them think about, okay, what would be the Spanish equivalent of these? How are people in the Spanish speaking world using these hashtags? We did a discussion board identifying and reacting to relevant social media posts. They chose 2 posts and explained how the issue is relevant in their own communities. And then they selected an environmental issue that they were passionate about to various extents, and created an awareness poster or campaign for that particular issue. Once they shared those, that was the presentation or communication piece. Students identified 1 or 2 posters from another student that resonated with them, and they prepared a list of interview questions for that poster's creator. And then finally, they engaged in an interpersonal dialogue with that student based on the interview framework that they did. And they developed action steps, including identifying organizations already engaged in that work. Again, I'm not trying to get my students to think about how they can start from scratch and solve these problems as if they're the only people to ever have thought about it, but really, how can they align to other work? I want to conclude before we do our Q&A with some do's and don'ts. So the first do that I have here is do conduct an audit of your curriculum. Think about whose voices, perspectives, histories, and cultures and experiences are underrepresented, overrepresented, not represented at all, et cetera. So this might bring light to some possible points of entry for more social justice oriented outcomes. Do collaborate within and across languages and disciplines. Collaborate in person and virtually. And this is especially important for those instructors who may be the only educator at their school or district who teaches a particular language. Do link social justice oriented goals to the students' own lives. Try not to frame it in terms of, target cultures and home cultures, but just think about it in terms of the human experience. What are we dealing with? Because a lot of these issues, I would say almost all of them, transcend national boundaries. And I think that approach combats some of the foreignness that's often associated with language study. Do tailor student expectations. Be open about your goals for social justice learning. You may want to include a statement about it in your syllabus. I have an example of that. If people are interested, just email me. Be proactive about some potential challenges. Don't just show up and just think that you're going to talk about a very controversial topic without having done any preparation, any thinking for the creative ways that people may intentionally or unintentionally derail the conversation. I try to give people a benefit of the doubt. Maybe they don't mean to derail the conversation, but it happens. And this will also help you to articulate your instructional approach to other stakeholders if necessary, especially if you do something like a syllabus statement, where you can link it back to the 5 C's and say, hey, this is what I'm supposed to be teaching, and this is why. And I think it's important for all of us to think through that process so that we're able to articulate that when needed. And then I have a few don'ts. Don't attempt a sweeping curricular overhaul. It might be tempting to take the most radical approach and burn it all down and start completely fresh, but that's overwhelming and you'll burn yourself out. So I think start small, start with 1 lesson, 1 unit, even 1 activity, 1 point of entry. Don't attempt to both sides all issues in the name of neutrality. In his introduction to the 30th anniversary edition of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Robert Shaw says there's no such thing as a neutral education. And as I said earlier, anyone who seriously studied education knows this. So don't present potentially discriminatory perspectives as reasonable options, right? And an example of that is off the top of my head, I wouldn't say, I don't know, does this population deserve rights? Should immigrants be allowed to work in the United States or something like that? Should immigrants be allowed to have basic needs, their basic needs met is essentially what you're asking. And when you put that up for debate, it opens up the door for discriminatory discussions to happen in class. And that's just one example of that. I know that we all want to try to be neutral, but there's some things that there just is no neutral position. So don't do that. And if you're uncomfortable with that, you might want to just look at ways that, to use that same example, you can frame it by saying, hey, let's look at ways that immigrants have been involved in their own liberation and in their own fights for justice. So asking how questions rather than either or questions is a way to address that as well. Don't limit the definition of social justice to just action. I don't want my students to feel like they have to create some solution to these problems. Like I said earlier, a lot of these populations and communities are already engaged in their own liberation. And I also don't want to instill a savior complex with my students. And I don't want to decenter the liberation work that's already done by communities that are often marginalized anyway. I don't want to marginalize them even further. And don't forget to celebrate success along the way. You'll need to have your students reflect on their learning so that you can see their progress. They can see their progress. This can be done via a self-assessment in which students reflect on their language proficiency-oriented goals and social justice goals so that they see how they're progressing both linguistically and in terms of their own individual transformation. So much of this transformational work is internal and the results may not always be immediately visible, and that's okay. So just celebrate the small victories along the way. I have here some resources for additional reading, the World-Readiness Standards, the Social Justice Standards, and in 3 books that I think are important. I have Glenn Wesley and Wassel's text there from ACTFL, Words and Actions. Cassandra Glenn and Cecilia Axelion recently published The Anti-Racist World Language Classroom, which I think is a great text. And then, as was mentioned earlier, my colleagues, Stacey Margarita Johnson and Kelly Francis Davidson and I published a collection of edited chapters called How We Take Action, Social Justice in the Pre-K through 16 Language Classroom. I think all of those are great resources to show you how different people in different contexts are engaging with this work. And then finally, this webinar was based on the chapter included in Honing Our Craft, an upcoming book co-edited by my colleagues and friends, Florencia Henshaw and Kim Patowski. So thank you. You can access the slides at this tiny URL link. I'll try to type that into the chat. And then you can also connect with me at my email there, lj.randolphjr@wisc.edu, or on social media at @ProfeRandolph.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Everybody is giving a nice round of applause to our presenter, Dr. LJ Randolph. And thank you for posting that in the chat, the link to the slides. And we will also share with all the webinar attendees the slides and the recording as well. So if you kind of missed that in the chat and can't get it, lose it later, it will be on its way to you shortly. And so we're going to move into our Q&A session. So I'm going to give you guys a minute or two. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to throw them in that Q&A box. And as our presenter mentioned, the kind of topic today came from a chapter in our Honing Our Craft volume, which I'm just going to take 1 minute while you guys are thinking of questions to kind of give you a little bit more information about. So LJ, I don't know if you want to stop sharing your screen real quick.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pop over and share mine. They're all seeing this. So it is a volume that is written by educators for educators. It's edited by, as LJ mentioned, Dr. Florencia Henshaw and Dr. Kim Patowski. And it's really kind of a volume. I love the title, you know, for us to hone our craft, right? And that is something that we do as educators, as teachers. So here is a brief, and I know it's small, but you can find more information on our website. Look at the table of contents for this volume that is coming. So you can see, you know, we're talking about social justice in the language classroom, differentiated instruction, working with our heritage and our native speakers, proficiency-based curriculum, incorporating technology, multiliteracy's approach. So a lot of hot button topics that you probably hear mentioned and words thrown around all of the time. And so we'll have that coming out to you shortly. Information is available on our website. And it is actually available now for pre-order if you are interested. So I just wanted to take a quick mention to give that shout out and to let you know that the Honing Our Craft volume has inspired our annual conference here with Collette World Languages. Our first one was last October. So our next one, year 2, is going to be again in October 7th and 8th in Chicago. So we hope you can come visit us. And if you would like to learn more about, social justice, pedagogies, and curriculum, LJ will be back with us in Chicago as one of our keynote speakers. So we're very much looking forward to having him again and to continuing to learn from him and his experience.
Me too.
So, all right, so we're going to move into the Q&A session. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your questions and your answers and your comments with us. And so my colleague Sabrina and I are going to be helping to moderate this. So I'll get started kind of with one of the first questions that came through, because I think it's an interesting question, and just given our current realities in the world, something that a lot of people might be thinking about. So for those people who are on board, they really want to incorporate a social justice curriculum, how might they be able to get the buy-in of students, right, who maybe have heard otherwise? The literal wording of the question was, how do you approach those students who believe they are being brainwashed? So how can we get buy-in from our students and our colleagues, other teachers and administrators if we want to incorporate this type of approach?
Right. And I, as I answer these questions, as I said earlier, I don't want to position myself as the expert. So people in the chat, feel free to contribute your answers as well, even as I'm answering the question. I think that social justice, that's a common misconception. It's like I'm trying to promote, this indoctrinate this liberal agenda or something, but it's about being honest, and it's about creating space for people who traditionally have not been included in the language classroom. And it's also about engaging students in critical thinking. So I would appreciate that type of pushback, because it means that people are thinking critically about it. And so we can talk about what that means, and why do they think these authors, the producers of the works that we're bringing, if it's an author or singer or something like that, why do they have these perspectives? So for example, using the Gina Torres quote that I used, which she talked about, she realized early on that the world liked their Latinas to look Italian and not like her. I wouldn't entertain the question of, do you think she's right? I would entertain the question of, why do you think she says this? What experiences has she had? What is her truth that has led her to have this perspective? And so that's something that, even if you disagree, I don't. I believe people when they talk about their own discrimination. But even if you're someone who's not there yet, where you're at the point where you're still pushing back, you can still engage in that conversation in a meaningful way about, well, what do you imagine may have happened to her for her to have this perspective? So I think those why questions, as I said earlier, are so much more important and interesting than the either or do you type questions. So that's one way of thinking about it. And then also it's about relationships. I think if you really focus a lot on building relationships with your students, having your students build relationships with one another, incorporating a lot of no stakes, low stakes activities, you can call them icebreakers or whatever you want to, but we don't do this every day. It's not, I don't start class and have students for 50 minutes or an hour and a half engage in these very high level, thought-provoking questions, all that mentally challenging questions all the time, right? So we think about ways that we can build relationships and rapport within the class. Maybe even having students work in small groups over an extended amount of time. If you're teaching year round for a few months, having students work in those small groups whenever they do something that you think there might need to be some relationships there for them to do this. And what happens is, even if someone says something that may be interpreted in other contexts to be politically incorrect, for example, I find that if those relationships are there, there's enough assumption of good intentions, and there's enough forgiveness for students to get past that. Versus if you just kind of start talking about this off the fly, then if the relationships aren't there, then all it takes is one student to say something that could slightly be interpreted the wrong way, and it's over, right? So.
Perfect.
And
Thank you.
also it's not an agenda, it's related to the standards. I think the very first thing that I did when we talked about curriculum is I brought up the 5 C's, and that's what we, as a profession, either explicitly or by default, that's what we collectively have agreed are the things that make up a language education, a good language education. We know that it's not just about communication, it's about those other 4 C's, it's about cultures, it's about communities. And so how can you say that language education is about cultures or communities, but then turn around and don't bring in those minoritized communities that have controversial takes on certain things? So.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that reply. For the next question, we had a few doubts about the Blaxican example that you mentioned. And one of the questions is whether the actual Blaxican term is embraced by that community in particular. And we can also connect that to the other question that mentions if the Afro-Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx is not a more respectful term.
Right, and that was one of the questions that I kind of got a glimpse of earlier, and I addressed very briefly, but that's important to keep in mind. These are not terms that I or someone else is imposing on these students, on these, I call them students. They might be, they're in their 20s, might be in college. That I'm not imposing this on these folks. These are terms that they have embraced. You saw from Larissa's comment, she likes the term Blaxican because it allows her to speak to her double identity, what she calls her double identity. So these are folks who have embraced that term. Now, does that mean that everybody in LA who is of Chicano or Mexican and Black descent embraces that term? No, absolutely not. But the people that we're talking about in that particular article, that's the term that they embrace. And also there's the article and then there's the video. The video is not necessarily related to the article. So that's another population from that community that also embraced the Blaxican term.
Great, thanks for clarifying that. We have several questions came in about language use and how you do this. And I know you mentioned the concept, you encourage translanguaging in your classroom. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more towards that in terms of, balancing using resources in English, and if, students responding in English, if they're, responding in both languages, and kind of, support for some teachers who might want to do that, but they receive pushback from other people in the department, their admin, about using English in the language classroom.
Right. I think this is Autumn. I have the Q&A pulled up. So Autumn, that's a great question. That's my former student. So, and my former advisee, she wrote a very good master's thesis. And I'm just singing her praises today. Awesome photographer as well. I think students need input in the language that you're teaching, and they need ways to express themselves in the language in order to grow in their proficiency. So we know that. That being said, language is, especially when you're talking about something like Spanish in the US, is messy. And some of the examples that I showed are not exactly examples that I use in my own class, but I just wanted to pick something that had sort of a common language that we can understand really quickly, or I translated it in order to show the resource. But for the most part, I do use resources that are in Spanish in the language that I teach. And like I said, I try to use things like in novice classes like TikTok, infographics, tweets, Instagram posts, memes, that kind of thing, where the language is very limited, but it's still quote unquote authentic in the sense that it was created by and for those speech communities outside of an educational context. But that being said, I also oftentimes incorporate resources that are in English. And an example of that would be that video. If we watched it, if you go back and watch that video, some of those folks speak in English. And there are examples of videos, in particular, of people who identify as Afro-Latinx, where they're speaking in English. And I say, who am I to say that your experience as an Afro-Latinx person is invalid because you are choosing to use English to express yourself rather than Spanish? Your cultural perspective is valid, and I want to include that into the classroom. So I do try to include it in the language that the person presented it. I don't want to see myself as a gatekeeper. Who am I to do that, right? And that takes away the way that the language naturally occurs. And then also there are people who engage in translanguaging all the time, like 90% of current popular music in US Spanish is, shows translanguaging or code switching to some extent. So that's the way that language actually occurs. So why would I not show my students the authentic way that people are engaging in the language? And so I think that's one way to do it. And then another thing that you can do, although I'm not sure if your organization, if your university has common assessments, but you can show them, hey, on this common assessment, my students still did fine. They still did within the range of other folks who claim that they use 100% Spanish all the time in class. And you can also use portfolio assessments to show what your students are capable of producing in the language. So I think those are some ways to show that, yeah, even though, and in some ways we take a more fluid approach to language in the classroom, my students are still learning Spanish, and I'm able to show you evidence of that via the assessments that we have. And also a lot of times, some of the deep critical thinking that I want them to do, I have them do that outside of class. And then we maybe spend like 10 or 15 minutes in class talking about common themes that came about from that. So they have the discussion outside of class via like a video chat, like a flip video, or a discussion board. And then I kind of summarize some of the key takeaways in class.
Perfect. That's awesome. Now, we mentioned, and there are a lot of questions about how to engage the students in the topic, but we also have a question about the teacher's perspective, and a specific one about what changes would you make, if any, as a white teacher in a majority BIPOC community, and how to actually amplify their voices while still teaching the new language and the new culture to them. So how to do it from that side.
Perfect. Ask them what they are already engaged in. What type of, I guess it depends. I'm thinking about a college level class here, but it works at the K through 12 level class as well, because they're writing poetry, they're creating songs, that kind of thing. Asking them what they are already creating, because a lot of times those students are already aware of social injustice and are engaged in their own liberation. So figuring out in what ways they are doing that type of work. I didn't show examples of that here. In my keynote, I might, because it's more related to themes of liberation, but through some of the topics that I've studied, I've had students share poetry and short essays and songs about ways that they have struggled with understanding their identities. And, in many cases, they've given me permission to use it in class, or they've actually published it and they just share with me the fact that they published this in a literary magazine or something like that. And so I think that's one way to engage the students a little bit more, and just having them see examples. Like I said earlier, I think representation is, I always say this, is the absolute lowest bar. It's like the easiest point of entry, and it's not enough by any means. So please don't stop at representation, but it is a necessary first step. So helping students see ways that BIPOC people in other communities are engaging with similar justice-oriented, liberation-oriented movements that they are, or that they know about, even if they aren't engaged in them. That's helpful.
Awesome. We have so many awesome and amazing questions coming into the Q&A. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I think sadly we will not be able to get to all of your questions, but thank you so much for submitting them. And we will share them with Dr. Randolph as well afterwards. And so let's see, maybe we can do kind of one more here.
I see one that this is,
Sure,
this
yeah,
might be the same person who asked it. They say, great to know. They might be the same. So I'm sorry if I'm doubling up on one person.
No,
but I see here, great to know, and how do we apply it to white students? And I think white students need this as well, even more. And also, I say two things. Tasha Austin published a piece that recently won an award at NECFL. And one of the quotes that stood out to me is she talks about how we're preparing the students and we're representing the world as it exists, not just our classroom. And they're Black people and BIPOC people all around, right? So that's the world that we live in. So students need that reality. They need to see a reality that represents that in the classroom. I'm debating if I should say this. I know it's being recorded, but I'm going to do it anyway, even if it gets me in trouble. As a Black person, and I sat in many classes where it was all about white folks. They'll be okay if they sit in one class that is not completely about white Eurocentric identities. They'll be okay, first of all. It's kind of like my snarky, sassy response. And there was something else that I wanted to say really quickly about that. And yeah, also, you don't know, even if your class has white faces, you don't know what types of relationships they have outside of class. One of my most meaningful interactions was with a white woman who was married to a Black man, had a Black stepson, and she texted me about how she learned more about race in that class than she had in any other context. And it helped her understand some of the things that her husband and her son had been expressing to her that she really didn't, just didn't have the reading, the knowledge to understand. And I thought it was cool that my little old third semester Spanish 201 class was the place where she came to understand some of those things. So you don't know what type of BIPOC people these folks are interacting with outside of the classroom. And so it's important for that reason as well.
No, yeah, thank you. And I think that's interesting. Well, I'll say one thing and then we'll probably do one more question to wrap up. So Sabrina, if you want to find one last question. I think about that too. In my heritage Spanish class I taught before I moved over to Clet World Languages, I had them read Ser Mujer Negra en España. So being a Black woman in Spain. And I was concerned because, I was like, this is all from a woman's perspective. And I had a lot of male students in my class. And I was like, oof. But then I was like, know what, right? They can identify with women as well. And, that's important, right? For us to be able to identify and hear stories from people, right? That, as you exactly said, is the world around us. This is our reality, right? So it's something I think we get concerned about, and then we take that breath and we're like, no, this is okay. So Sabrina, do we have one last question?
Yes, we have a lot of interesting questions, but I think we can close with a different approach one. which speaks, this one focuses more on the language itself. So the question says if you think that standardized language contributes to the oppression and the social injustice. I think we could use easily the example of Spanish, whether it's oppressive to teach the canonical, maybe Spain or Mexico's variety, or whether, especially when many students expect to be taught to speak the right way and maybe resist to more open approaches.
Yeah, shameless plug. Join me if you're going to be at AATSP in Salamanca this summer. I'm doing a session on critical language awareness in the mixed classroom based on a chapter that I wrote maybe like a few months ago at this point. And I'm currently co-authoring a chapter about Black liberation via language in the Spanish classroom. And it talks a lot about some of the things that you mentioned, Sabrina, with that question. And it's a lot to unpack. And so if I had to answer this in like 30 seconds, I would say, as much as possible, bring in examples of that language in the classroom as input that students receive, and do it in a way that is not, it's not like, okay, here's the special day, we're going to look at this weird Spanish, but it's normalized within the classroom, and it's an example of the authentic ways that communities are engaging with the language, and you approach it with this intellectual care that you would approach with standard, what we call standard Spanish or whatever. So I think that's one thing to do, helping students to understand the patterns in those languages. All of these varieties have patterns and are rule governed to some extent. And so none of them are less valid than others. And I think any difference that we assign to them is all political, and many times rooted in white supremacy and coloniality. And so helping students to become mini linguists and look at, why does it make sense that in certain varieties of Mexican Spanish, they add the S to the second person singular, the preterite? Well, because it's the only second person that doesn't have an S. So actually, it's more logical to put it there. They're advanced, right? So I think that's one way. And then helping students, empowering students to decide, okay, now with all of this information, with this metalinguistic knowledge, with this critical language awareness, in which contexts and in which environments do I want to use the various linguistic repertoires that I have, without you telling me this is the appropriate place to speak in this particular way.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. All right, so we are exactly at 7:30 here, so we will wrap
Can I
up.
make a recommendation? Yeah. It's not in Spanish, but it's I think just from understanding this issue from a larger sociolinguistic perspective, it's April Baker Bell's book, Linguistic Justice. So if you read that, it's about English language arts, but there's so many parallels to this discussion that we're having right now.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for that. Would you be able to put that in the title in the chat real quick for people, Alger?
Yes, I'll do that right now. Yep.
Thank you. So yeah, thank you everybody for attending. Let's give one last round of applause for our presenter today. You will be getting the recording and the slides coming your way shortly. And we do have 2 upcoming webinars. So we'll end with this on the 22nd. We have a webinar in Spanish, Estrategias y Actividades Creativas para la clase de español. And then we have another webinar on the 26th. This one will be in English, Incorporating Education for Sustainable Development in the World Language Classroom. So we hope to see you all again. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Enjoy.